the night my son introduced his fiancée to our family. I thought I was witnessing the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. I was wrong. My wife, Margaret, had spent the entire afternoon preparing for the dinner. She had cooked our son Daniel's favorite meal, arranged flowers across the dining table, and even pulled an old dress from the back of her closet. It was a simple blue dress. She had worn it years ago, on one of the happiest nights of our marriage. When she walked downstairs, I smiled. "You look beautiful." I told her. She laughed softly. "You've told me that for 35 years, and I've been right every time." She shook her head, but I could see the happiness in her eyes. Daniel arrived at 7 with his fiancée, Vanessa. Vanessa was elegant, confident, and perfectly dressed. She entered the house as though she already owned it. "Mrs. Carter," she said, giving Margaret a quick hug. "You look vintage." Margaret smiled politely. "I suppose that's one word for it." Dinner began pleasantly enough. Daniel talked about work. Vanessa talked about their wedding plans. They were considering an expensive venue, a designer dress, and a guest list that seemed to grow larger every 5 minutes. Then Vanessa mentioned something that changed the mood. "Daniel told me this house will eventually be ours." I looked at my son. He lowered his eyes. Margaret slowly placed her fork down. Eventually, Vanessa smiled. "Well, you two won't need such a large house forever. Will you?" I felt my blood pressure rise. "This house belongs to us," I said calmly. "Of course," Vanessa replied. I didn't mean anything by it, but her expression said otherwise. Margaret tried to change the subject. She asked Vanessa about her parents. Vanessa answered briefly, before turning the conversation back toward the wedding. Then she noticed Margaret's dress. "That really is an unusual choice," she said. Margaret looked down. "I like it, I'm sure you do." The words were polite. The tone was not. I wanted to end the evening right there, but Daniel begged us to give Vanessa a chance. "She's nervous," he whispered to me when Margaret went to the kitchen. "She's disrespectful," I replied. "She just wants everything to be perfect." I looked at my son. "You need to understand the difference between perfection and control." He said nothing. After dinner, Margaret brought out a small box. Inside was an antique necklace that had belonged to her mother. "I thought you might like to wear this on your wedding day," Margaret told Vanessa. Vanessa stared at it. "How much is it worth?" The question shocked me. Margaret blinked. "It's not about the money." Vanessa shrugged. "It's beautiful, though." She took the necklace and held it against her neck. Then she noticed something else. A small scar near Margaret's shoulder, partly visible above the neckline of her dress. Vanessa frowned. "What happened there?" Margaret immediately pulled the fabric higher. Nothing important, but Vanessa kept staring. Daniel suddenly became uncomfortable. "Mom, you never told me about that." Margaret smiled faintly. "There are some things parents don't tell their children until they're ready." Vanessa laughed. "That sounds dramatic." I stood up enough. The room went silent. Vanessa looked at me. "I was only asking," and my wife answered. For the first time that evening, Vanessa looked angry. She stood up abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor. "I don't understand why everyone is so sensitive." Margaret turned away. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't as Vanessa walked past Margaret. Her hand caught the sleeve of the blue dress. There was a sharp ripping sound. The fabric tore from the shoulder down the side. Margaret gasped. The room froze. Vanessa immediately stepped back. "I didn't do that on purpose." Margaret looked down at the torn dress. Then she looked at Vanessa. Her face had gone completely pale. The tear had exposed the scar. It wasn't a small scar. It stretched across Margaret's shoulder and down toward her back, an old jagged mark that looked like the memory of a terrible accident. Vanessa stared at it. Her expression changed. The arrogance disappeared. Her eyes widened. "No." Margaret covered the scar with her hand. Vanessa whispered again, "No." "That can't be." I stepped between them. "What do you know about that scar?" Vanessa didn't answer. Daniel looked confused. "Vanessa," she backed away. "I need to leave." She grabbed her purse, but before she could reach the door, Margaret spoke. "Wait." Vanessa stopped. Margaret's voice was trembling. "You recognized it." Vanessa turned around slowly. I saw it before where Vanessa's eyes filled with tears on a photograph. My heart stopped. What photograph? She looked at Daniel, then at Margaret. My mother kept an old photograph in a locked box. Margaret's face changed. What was in the photograph? Vanessa swallowed. There was a woman standing beside a burned car. Silence filled the room. I felt my hands begin to shake. Margaret sat down. Tell me what else you remember. Vanessa wiped her eyes. The woman had this exact scar. Daniel stared at his mother. Mom, what is she talking about? Margaret looked at him for the first time in 30 years. I saw fear in my wife's eyes. She whispered, your father and I were involved in an accident before you were born. Daniel looked stunned. I knew about the accident. No, Margaret said. You knew what we wanted you to know. She took a deep breath. Your father was driving home from the hospital when another car crossed the center line. The crash killed the other driver. Vanessa's lips trembled. My mother always said the accident wasn't an accident. Margaret looked at her. She was right. Vanessa stepped forward. My mother was the passenger. I felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath me. Daniel stared between the two women. What are you saying? Vanessa began crying. My mother survived that crash. She spent years searching for the woman who pulled her out of the burning car. Margaret closed her eyes. I pulled her out. Vanessa covered her mouth. You, Margaret nodded. I couldn't save the driver. But I saved your mother. Vanessa's anger vanished completely. My mother told me the rescuer had been badly burned. Margaret touched the scar. She exaggerated. No. Vanessa whispered she didn't. Margaret looked at her. Your mother was unconscious when I found her. I carried her away from the car. The fire caught my dress. That's how I got the scar. Daniel sat down. Why didn't you ever tell me? Margaret looked at him sadly. Because after the accident, your father blamed himself. We decided to leave the past alone. Vanessa slowly approached Margaret. I spent years believing your family had something to do with my mother's suffering. Margaret shook her head. We were suffering too. Vanessa looked at the torn dress. Then she looked at Margaret. I was cruel to you. Margaret didn't respond. I judged you. Vanessa continued. I thought you were an old-fashioned woman trying to control everything. Her voice broke. But you saved my mother's life. Margaret reached for her hand. You didn't know. Vanessa began sobbing. I ripped your dress. Margaret gave a sad smile. Clothes can be repaired, but what I said. Words can be repaired too. Daniel stood and walked toward his mother. Mom, I'm sorry. She looked at him. For what? For letting Vanessa disrespect you. Margaret hugged her son. You were trying to build a life. Sometimes people become blind when they're afraid of losing someone. Daniel looked toward Vanessa. I almost lost my family because I didn't see what was happening. Vanessa nodded through her tears. I understand if you don't want me here. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something none of us expected. Sit down. Vanessa hesitated. Please. She sat beside Margaret that night. The wedding plans were forgotten. Instead, the two women talked for hours. Vanessa told us about her mother, who had spent decades carrying guilt because she believed she had caused the accident. Margaret explained that she had never blamed her. By midnight, the anger that had filled the house had been replaced by something else. Understanding. Months later, Daniel and Vanessa did get married. But they changed everything. The huge wedding became a small ceremony. Margaret wore the same blue dress. The tear had been carefully repaired, and Vanessa wore the antique necklace Margaret had given her. Before the ceremony, Vanessa approached Margaret. Can I tell you something? Margaret smiled. Of course, I used to think that scar was something ugly. She gently touched the repaired seam of Margaret's dress. Now I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You know what I learned? She asked. Vanessa shook her head. A scar doesn't tell you how someone was broken. Margaret smiled. It tells you they survived. I watched the two women embrace, and I realized something I would never forget. Sometimes the person we judge the fastest is carrying a story we never bothered to hear. Sometimes anger is born from ignorance, and sometimes one unexpected moment can reveal a truth. powerful enough to change an entire family. That torn dress had seemed like the beginning of a family disaster. Instead, it became the thread that finally connected two families, separated by decades of pain. And every time I saw Margaret wearing that repaired blue dress, I remembered the lesson: you can tear fabric in a second, but healing what is underneath can take a lifetime.